الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين اللهم صل على محمد. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of here and the hereafter. We convey our greeting and salutation to the Holy Prophet of Islam and his pure progenies. Assalamu alaikum everyone, sisters and brothers. We have two brothers here at the center, and the rest, I believe, the one have joined could be both. An interesting question was posed during the conversation that we had last week regarding going back and somehow assessing or reflecting on major sources and the names of the early history, or what we call classical scholars. Before I actually start doing that, I would like to start with what we call a preamble, so that you understand how difficult it is. Even if we were to start, no matter when you're going to start, because the overlap that takes place within the scholars, some of them are fuqaha, and then at the same time they are scholars of hadith, at the same time they are mutakallimin, at the same time they come within irfan and mysticism, so it becomes very difficult to identify or designate a particular class or group to them. I've done my best to select few of the early ones, since it was mentioned that the four major books of hadith at least somehow related to that, compared to the six sahah that Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah has. The first point that I would like to discuss is the issue of recording of hadith. At least what we have documented, the second Khalifa Umar prevented any recording and narration or transmission of any hadith during his life at least, and that ban and prohibition stayed in place up to year 99 Hijri, which Umar ibn Abdul Aziz revoked it and allowed the recording and transmission as well as writing and compiling of hadith to take place. As far as the Sunni community, one of the consequences of this decision is you have a gap, a period in which nobody transmitted or recorded or compiled any hadith. So after, say, 70, 80 years, when the prohibition was revoked and people literally made a run for finding out a hadith, in between the 70, 80 years, a huge number of muhaddithin that Sunnis would rely upon it vanished. Because they were unable to record, they were unable to transmit, they were unable to compile. So there is always what we call a gap in the transition of ahadith that Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah narrate. And they have no other alternative but to somehow a jump would take place, an fulan, an fulan, an fulan, an Rasulullah. There is no clear and concise generation after generation taking place because of that huge gap. Not only that prohibition created some challenges for ahadith that Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah have narrated, it had a benefit as far as they were concerned, that it forced what we call theologian and fuqaha of Ahl Sunnah to start writing and compiling books much earlier than what we had within the Shia. Why? Because Shia, so long as Imams existed, there was no need. Shia followers of Ahlul Bayt, no matter where they would try their utmost to at least once a year, they pile up all the questions that they had. And then during Hajj and Umrah, they go to Medina and ask directly the Imam, whether Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and the rest of the Imams. This became critical for the latter part of the Imamah, which the Imam from the 10th Imam and 11th Imam, when the Imams were under house arrest, which means people really had no access to them. During that period, scholars began, fuqaha, that the Imams had given them permission and rukhsa to begin giving fatwa. They began to develop the basis for what we call fiqh and fiqh analysis and become somehow quasi-faqih. Because so long as the Imam exists, they find it difficult to start giving fatwa. Even the early books that were compiled by these fuqaha, they were nothing more than hadith that narrated from various Imams, and they simply made a the fuqaha made a footnote on this hadith that we have recorded this directly from the Imam, or we heard it from such a person, and we tend to agree with it. Or if there were question marks, they would outline it. So we have early on, which is literally during the life of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, Abu Hanifa starts organizing the Kufa school of theology, which is one of the schools that Sunnis have. Four schools: Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali. Maliki was the Medina school. Abu Hanifa was the Kufa school. Shafi'i later on came to be the Egyptian school, and Hanbali was the Damascus or the Syrian or Sham school. Abu Hanifa being number one at least, Malik in Medina, Abu Hanifa starting the school of theological discourse and jurisprudential point of view way before the Shias were able to do themselves. The crisis came head on for the Shia community, the beginning of what we call the short minor occultation. Now, Imam that played a central role for literally everything the Shias had no longer is available or visible, and we have to search or navigate our way to find a solution for our crisis in the light of the absence of the Imam. Year 260 starts and 320. This is Hijri Qamari, the calendar. During the short occultation, at least you had four major representatives of the Imam being available, that people somehow managed to get to them and give them the question, and they would take it back to the Imam. And after that, the beginning of the long occultation made it extremely difficult. Now you have no what we call wakil that would take the questions and the money and concern directly to the Imam, and you have no access to the Imam. Literally now the transition has taken place, a shift has taken place into proper fuqaha. Now they have to start giving fatwas, they have to deal with books of hadith, they have to compile hadith, transmit hadith, establish the criteria of what hadith is to be accepted and relied upon, what hadith is considered to be weak. During 70 years, thousands upon thousands of fabricated hadith found its way within at least within the Sunni tradition, but some of them came into the Shia tradition. Why? Because somebody narrates from Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, and we have no, in some of the books, we have no way of establishing. This is number two. So even if we were to start talking about books of fuqaha, it has to start from Ghibat al-Sughra, the short occultation. We can't go before it. I'm not saying that before it scholars of fuqaha did not exist. They did. But because the Imam was present, and the presence of the Imam which literally clips the wing of all the scholars, they had to submit to the authority. They had no power, or even if they wrote anything or gave fatwa that we see beginning of it, the ijtihad, the word ijtihad being used by 5th Imam and 6th Imam during their leadership, that they said, we would like identify a particular group of scholars with unique intellectual capacity. We would like you to sit in the mosque and give fatwa and become a mujtahid, knowing fully well that at the end of the day, these people would come to the imam and ask their questions. And if they needed any debate, assessment, and so on, they would clarify it with the imam and then go out. And imam couldn't go out directly and challenge, say, people like Abu Hanifa or Malik or anybody else, but people who were trained by the imam were able, as scholars of the Ja'fari school of thought, would go sit in the mosque and give fatwa. So this is number one. Number two. Number three, there is a major difference between our approach, Shia approach, to the four major books. We have many of them, but these four are the ones that are relied upon by a number of scholars, fuqaha these days. If you go to Bahth al-Kharij, which is an analytical discourse that the grand scholar has, he lays down, poses the question regarding a particular issue and assesses the entire ahadith that exist. Where does he get them from? From these books. The major difference between Ja'fari school and Sunni school, all four of them, when it comes to the books of hadith, is that we don't consider any of our books, whether it's Kafi, Man la yahdaruhu al-faqih, Tahdhib, or Istibsar, these four major ones, any of these ahadith in them as non-touchable. We consider all the ahadith within these books have to be taken, assessed, because of the crisis, or early crisis that we had with fabricated ahadith. Some later on admitted that they have fabricated a number of hadith, and this found its way into the books of hadith. For us, we have ilm al-hadith, and ilm al-hadith classify or designates these ahadith. Some muhaddithin say to 60 different categories, some people say 40 different categories, less or more, which they look at the hadith, starting from right from the person that narrates the hadith. They look at the chain, trustworthiness of the individual, the content of the hadith, whether it counters other hadith, whether it counters verses in the Holy Quran, whether it counters the Sunnah, etc., etc., and then ultimately accept or reject. Sunni scholars, they consider any hadith in Sahih al-Sitta, that most famous is Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, literally as infallible, these individuals, and their ahadith untouchable. Recently, we have noticed particularly I was surprised a few weeks ago, within Wahhabis, there are a number of scholars coming out that we really need to go back, revisit Sahih Bukhari, and address some of these ahadith and look at it critically. This, what we call a critical study, comes back now to percolate through and get into these books. They are afraid that if the books are touched and considered literally debatable, close to 90% of the ahadith that these books have narrated, you have to cross them out. Because you just imagine Sahih Bukhari narrates from Fatima al-Zahra, I think, one or not more than 5 hadith, and yet from Abu Huraira close to 600, or some people say 6,000. Although Abu Huraira was with the Holy Prophet only about a year and a half, and Fatima al-Zahra from the beginning, or from Ali 15 or 20 or 30 hadith. There is a tendency by these scholars to marginalize Ahlul Bayt and to get a hadith from other sources. This is why when it comes, once this is established without shadow of a doubt, our scholars, they would not, first of all, they would touch a hadith from Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim or any other Sahih with a pinch of salt. They don't consider them as trustworthy to begin with, unless you can establish it. The book which I will mention in a few minutes, Marhum Tusi Khilaf, one of the books of hadith that he talks about, deliberately focuses on ahadith, the differences that exist between Shia and Sunnis vis-a-vis the ahadith. And I will say a little bit about why it's so unique about his teacher, Sheikh Mufid, and he himself. These two individuals played a major role. Those of you who are interested, a friend of mine, Professor Mudarrisi, has a book, Crisis and Consolidation in the Formative Period of Shia Islam. Read it. It's critical. If you have time, I'm sure Brother Ali has a magic source that very quickly he gets the PDF version of it. If you can, send it to everybody else. And there are other, Professor Newman and few others that they have talked about the history of Shi'ism, and particularly as they go through from early history, but what they call during the period of crisis and so on. You can. Yeah, it's crisis and consolidation in the formative period of Shia Islam or Shiite Islam, and it's Hussein Mudarrisi, which focuses on that particular period in which now Imam is absent, or at least is not visible. What is the role of the scholars? And they really sacrifice. Shia is indebted. I know the Imam Zain al-Abidin, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, and the rest of the Imams worked hard. But the role of these scholars during this period was so unique that had not they challenged and been able to establish, write books, compile hadith, etc., etc., we will not have been in the state that we are in now. So we start with the first individual, Abu Ja'far al-Core books. The first book is Al-Kafi. It's been translated into English. Primarily, it focuses on aqaid, because the end of he died around 329, which is literally at beginning of Ghibat al-Kubra, the long occultation, and end of Ghibat al-Sughra. He was born during the life of the 11th Imam, and he studied in Qum primarily. Qum became the center of Shia community, and we see reasons for it during the life of the 6th Imam, and particularly 7th and 8th Imam, where they begin to send their representatives to various parts. Khurasan becomes one critical center. Qum becomes another critical center. Ray, which is Shah Abdul Azim in Tehran, close to Tehran, now is part of Tehran, becomes another center. Isfahan later on, Shiraz, Qazvin, and so on, they become various centers. But Qum was among the first centers. When the sister of Imam Rida salawatullah salam alayh, Sayyidah Ma'asuma travels from Medina to go to see her brother and dies and moves through Qum, because Qum had already established itself as a center for Shia. This is why it was very easy for her to pass through. And she passed away over there, and her mausoleum and burial sites is there. So we start with Kulaini. In this book, Al-Kafi, which has been translated into English, there are 16,000 ahadith. And they are divided into 3 sections: Usul al-Kafi, Furu' al-Kafi, and Rawdat al-Kafi. Most of these are not useful for, it just becomes an academic issue for you unless you are you want to get the book, read it, and so on. Usul al-Kafi, primarily a hadith that focuses on fundamental principle of faith. Tawheed, Adl, Imama, Nubuwwah, Ma'ad, these kind of things. Then you have Furu' al-Kafi that focuses on ahadith that are used by scholars in fiqh. So it's primarily fiqh ahadith. And Rawdat al-Kafi is a miscellaneous book that mixes everything together. So if you look at the translation, Al-Kafi was translated, I think, about 30 or 40 years ago by a Shahristani group in Iran, and it was Sayyid Razvi that translated it. That translation was a bit awkward linguistically, and I believe Sheikh Arasto and a number of other people decided to go and revise this translation and make it a little bit better. Some of these chapters I have looked at. It's much better English than Sayyid Radwi that had done it, but broadly speaking, these are the three books. Sheikh al-Kulaini, although is not considered to be a faqih, but he's considered to be a muhaddith because he compiles huge amount of hadith. Most of these muhaddithin, from Shia point of view, they make it clear that they don't claim that all the ahadith that they have in their books are sahih 100%. But they see their role as a preserver of these ahadith. The sooner we collect them and compile them, the better it is, because by then Sunnis have already begun to develop an extensive books about ahadith. By the end of the 1st century, beginning of 2nd century, Sunnis had their own books of hadith. So that way they preserved theirs. These scholars said, well, we will preserve it, and then we would leave it to muhaddithin who developed the science of hadith to be able to sift through these hadith and establish which one is acceptable and not acceptable. That's not for us to say. We were just a protector of these hadith. This is why what Sheikh al-Kulaini has in his book. So he dies around the end of Ghibat al-Sughra, beginning of Ghibat al-Sughra. The next one, which is critical, is Sheikh Ali ibn Babawayh al-Qummi, that died around the same age as Sheikh al-Kulaini. Again, Sheikh al-Kulaini died although he was from Ray, close to Tehran, but ultimately traveled around in Iran and settled in Baghdad. His mausoleum is in Baghdad. You can go to Sheikh al-Kulaini's mausoleum. It's a little bit dilapidated like everything else in Iraq. And Ibn Babawayh died around 329 again, and he's buried in Qom. He is the father. He is a faqih. This is why I start with him as the first faqih. But he is the father of his son, the son, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Babawayh, that we call well known within muhaddithin, not faqih. Although he was faqih, but he is more known about ahadith that he narrates. And Sheikh Saduq, his book, Man La Yahdarahu al-Faqih. Again, well-known book that is the second book within the 4 books that we really need to if you ever want to understand the 4 major books. So we have first Kulaini and Usul al-Kafi. 2 is Man La Yahdar al-Faqih, which is Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Babawayh, Sheikh Saduq, and he's buried in Shahr Ray, which is close to Tehran. And he has I believe he has a commentary on Usul al-Kafi and Tahdhib al-Ahkam and few other, not Tahdhib al-Ahkam, and few other books before him. So the 4 major books, I repeat again, Kafi, Usul al-Kafi, Man La Yahdarahu al-Faqih, Tahdhib al-Ahkam, and Al-Istibsar. Tahdhib al-Ahkam and Istibsar are books authored by Sheikh Tusi. We will briefly talk about him. Man La Yahdarahu al-Faqih by Sheikh Saduq, and Kafi is from Sheikh al-Kulaini. The first major scholar that we really need to spend huge amount of time assessing his life is Sheikh Mufid. Sheikh Mufid is considered to be, one could not say, no matter what we say about him, it's not enough. During his leadership, before his death. 3 letters he receives directly from our living Imam, and to him directly. And in one letter, Imam calls him our dear brother. That shows the degree of honor and respect that Imam has for this unique character. And Muhammad ibn Nu'man, he is mutakallim as well as faqih, as well as he has a number of other books. He is the tilmid, or the student of Sheikh Saduq that we talked about when it comes to hadith, about man la yahdar al-faqih. He studied under him, and he has huge number of scholars as his students. Sheikh Tusi is well known. 2 brothers, Sayyid Murtada and Sayyid Radhi. Those of you who are familiar with Nahj al-Balagha, Sayyid Radhi, his brother is faqih, Sayyid Murtada. And after him, after Sheikh Mufid died, Sayyid Murtada took the leadership of a Shia community in Baghdad, and his student Sheikh Tusi, that studied under Sheikh Mufid 5 years, and then studied under Sayyid Murtada, and then had to travel to Najaf, and literally became the founder of the Hawza al-Ilmiya in Najaf. It's Sheikh Tusi, one of the students of Sheikh Mufid. He used to teach in a place or a mosque called Masjid al-Baratha, which is still exists in Baghdad, near Karkh, which is a section in Baghdad. Masjid al-Baratha still exists. His book library was set alight by the Sunni mobs when they attacked him. He had a unique character. Because he was mutakallim, theologian, he could debate with the Asha'ira and Mu'tazilis. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Because he was extremely able to challenge, he used to dress incognito and go to the teaching or the mosque or the places where Sunni scholars were teaching their own students. Sit over there. As soon as they finish, as we say, raise your hand, and Ustad, I have a question. And that was the end of the person. And his reputation became so well known that even incognito, as soon as he started talking, they knew Sheikh Mufid is there. He has books in fiqh, over 200 books. He has books in fiqh, in Tafsir al-Quran, Al-Kalam fi Dala'il al-Quran, A'jaz al-Quran, Al-Bayan fi Ta'rif al-Quran, and a number of other books. In Kalam, Awa'il al-Maqalat, and a number of others. Brother Hamza talked about Irshad Sheikh Mufid, that it's been translated. It's a book of history that he has written. Probably after Tarikh Tabari is one of the oldest book that we could have access to. Extremely able and extremely scholarly, and huge number of students came out of his teaching. But the most famous among them are Sayyid Murtada, Sayyid Radhi, and Sheikh Tusi. Because these were the one that literally took from Sheikh Mufid, and particularly Sheikh Tusi moved to establish Najaf, Hawza al-Ilmiya, which is over now 1,100 and some years old. One of the differences that exist within the Shia and Sunni vis-a-vis the Fuqaha, I don't believe this characteristic exists within the Sunnis, that you can have a faqih, starting say from Sayyid al-Hakim, may God bless his soul, or Sayyid al-Khoy, or Marhum Imam, and so on. And you can literally, step by step, move until the Ahd al-Imam, and link the scholars. This chain of fuqaha, let's say, Marhum Imam studied under Marhum Burujirdi, let us for argument. Marhum Burujirdi studied under this scholar. That scholar studied under that scholar. And literally, you could go back one by one until you get to Sheikh Tusi, and from Sheikh Tusi, Sayyid Murtada, and Sheikh Mufid, Sheikh Saduq, and you go so on until you get directly to the Imams. This is a unique characteristic that exists within the Shia fiqh. I don't believe it exists because the Sunni fiqh, anybody can get permission and move somewhere else and give fatwa. You don't need to link and establish your own credential, particularly Wahhabis. They don't need it, just give fatwa. So, Sheikh Mufid, if you want, one day, inshallah, we can spend a little bit of time more in giving detail on the life of Sheikh Mufid. The person that comes after him is Sheikh Tusi, is called Sheikh al-Ta'ifa. Because, again, he moved one of the most famous, after Sheikh Mufid, the most famous scholars in the Shia scholarly tradition. And he has books in fiqh, usul, hadith, tafsir, kalam, and other things. He died, originally he was from Khurasan, this is why it's called Sheikh Tusi, but traveled around Iran and ultimately settled in Baghdad, studied under Sheikh Mufid. He was born 385, now well into the long occultation. If 320 or 330 we consider to be 25, we consider to be the beginning of long occultation. 380 is 50 or 60 years into the long occultation. And after the burning of the libraries of Sheikh Mufid in Baghdad, he decided that it was too dangerous to stay in Baghdad and moved to Najaf and established the Hawza there and remained within Najaf. His place of burial grave is within the Haram. As you walk in, it's over there, you can see it. He also had access to a huge number of books, and that reflects on the number of ahadith that he narrates. 2 books that he calls, number one, as far as the 4 books, Tahdib al-Ahkam and Istibsar are the 2 books of hadith, but he also has another book in fiqh, Al-Nihaya, Al-Mabsut, wa Al-Khilaf. Al-Khilaf probably puts him among the first scholars, Shia scholars, that draws a comparative study between sources of Sunnah and sources of Shia, vis-a-vis a particular theological or jurisprudential. So let's assume with regard to wudu, the Shias say this, and they rely on 1, 2, 3 ahadith. Hanafi school of theology says that and relies on 1, 2, 3. So the faqih, when they want to assess the fatwa and be able to give fatwa, Khilaf becomes a critical book. And see way back up to then how the fatwa of Ahl Sunnah and Ahl Shia framed themselves vis-a-vis different hadith. And he talks about various hadith that he rejects within, and he also had access to not only library of Marhum Sheikh Mufid, he had access to the library probably well known scholar Sayyid Murtada that collected huge amount of books in libraries. So Sheikh Tusi made huge use of these. In Tahdib, he collects about 13,590 hadith. Again, remember what I said, a proviso. None of these scholars claim that all of these ahadith are trustworthy. There is a difference. Probably when it comes to understanding of Quran, if you see a hadith from Kafi or anybody else that says, well, there is a hadith that Quran was tempered with within the Shia sources, there is a huge difference between this hadith and the hadith that exists in Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim or anybody else, because they consider those ahadith trustworthy 100%. We consider them debatable. So when there is a hadith, if you go to a book that Marhum Khoyi wrote about Tafsir, first volume, just only he wrote one volume, Al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran, and he talks about whether there is a fabrication or change in the Holy Quran. And he draws a comparison between a hadith that Shia might have in Kafi and the one that exists in Sahih Bukhari. This is a huge difference. Books, a hadith of Sahih Bukhari is considered to be literally untouchable. So when they say an Aisha, that there used to be a hadith, a verse in the Holy Quran much bigger than Surah Al-Baqarah, clearly opens up the can of worms. You really trust this hadith beyond shadow of a doubt. The whole authenticity of Quran, there is a question mark. But because we don't consider any of these ahadith to be initially trustworthy, unless we push them through the assessment and analysis, let them be these ahadith. We can reject them. Then, after Sheikh Tusi, we move into 3 or 4 major scholars. Allama Hilli, which died born 648 and died 726, one of the great scholars of fiqh in Shia tradition. Muhammad ibn Makki, he was from Jabal Amil in Lebanon, and he was born 736, was killed 786 by a fatwa of a Maliki and a Shafi'i faqih in Syria. During his imprisonment, he wrote a book, Al-Lum'ah, which now has become one of the major books for students in Hawza to read. Strangely enough, the one who wrote commentary on Lum'ah, Sheikh Zainuddin, was also killed by Sunnis around the same age, 50 years of age. So, Sharh al-Lum'ah al-Dimashqiyya by Shahid Awal, Sharh al-Lum'ah by Shahid Thani. Then after him, we have huge number of scholars gradually coming down, and a number of books written, Jawahir, Sharaya, and other books, which are not necessary at this stage. But I just wanted you to understand, since the question was posed, that in comparison to the 6 books of Sahih, what are the 4 books or that we consider to be, we don't consider them to be 100% trustworthy, we consider them worthy of looking at these ahadith. There is a concept that you may come across, inshallah, if one day we talk about hadith, usul al-arba'a and kutub al-arba'a. There is a concept within al-hadith. There are usul in hadith. There is a difference between asl and kitab. Kitab is a book which was authored by an individual. He's the one who collected the ahadith and wrote them down. Asl is a hadith that the person hears them from somebody else, but not necessarily he's the one that writes them. So we have usul al-arba'a within our tradition, which some of we don't mention them because most of these ahadith from usul al-arba'a has been collected within the 4 major books. There is also wasa'il al-Shia, which is later on added to these books. And if you go to the library of any major scholar, now you will find these books. One of the major work that has been done in Qom during the past 20 and 30 years, most of these books of hadith are not now compiled into CDs. You really don't need hundreds of or possibly thousands of books in your library. You can collect books of hadith in 4 or 5 CDs that you can use them, and they have commentaries on them, assessment, whether they are all the books that assessed and analyze hadith are now have been put on these CDs. I remember during my days in Najaf, we had
books of hadith from it. Only Rawat al-Hadith, which was the chain of narration from Sayyid al-Khoury, nearly 20 volumes. Now they all gone, CDs. You don't need them. And you, at the same time, now you can say a particular hadith, Zurara. You click on his name, various views of scholars come out, whether they consider this person to be trustworthy, not trustworthy, what's his history, how, which imam did he work with, and trust, and etc., etc. It's a huge advantage now for those who are going to do research in this field. But remember how difficult it was for people like Sheikh Mufid to write 200 books when most of the facilities and the means that are now available for us, wonderful camera, wonderful software, click, and the whole thing comes out in front of you. The entire information collection of 200 years, bingo, right in front of you. Now it's much easier for the scholars to do research, and this is why lately, again, a close friend of mine, Sayyid Shahristani, Sayyid Jawad Shahristani in Qom, the son-in-law of Ayatollah Sistani, has established a research department. Last year when I went there, I just couldn't believe my eyes how much the research in things have become easier. Because now you have fast computers that they have them, and the collection all are there. You only need to wish, and the genie gives you your command. At your command, comes up. The entire thing comes up. The entire research history comes up. So, but people like Sheikh Tusi, Sheikh Sayyid Murtada, Sayyid Radi, Allama Hilli, Shahid Awal, Shahid Thani, and Sahib Jawahir, Sahib Sharaya, these are really worked hard to preserve these and then ultimately come to us. Inshallah, I have already spent close to 45 minutes on this. If there are any questions, we will address them. If not, then if you want, I can, in future weeks, focus on one particular individual, at least within these 4 major books, and give detailed assessment of their life. How spend, where did they go? Because collection of hadith were not easy those days, these scholars had to travel all over the place. As soon as they heard that there is a muhaddith that narrates hadith from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq or has had connection to other muhaddithin, they would go. The concept of اطلب العلم ولو بالصين that has been narrated, that you go even in China, go after it. Because this is something that we really need to preserve. Those days, it was literal. Not just come here and sit down, go through computers, and you have all the tafasirs or ahadith, everything else assessed in front of you. They really traveled. Sheikh al-Kulaini went around. Sheikh Saduq went around. His father in Qom, he left Qom at the age of 20. Came to Tehran. From Tehran went to Khurasan, went to other centers. Everywhere that you had muhaddithin or fuqaha would go to them and collect from them. And then ultimately you end up somewhere else as a student of grand scholar. Those days, I strongly recommend read this book. This was really a period of crisis. The consolidation took place by the hard work of these individuals. Otherwise, we would have been in a huge mess. As theologically, or at least from Aqidah point of view, it shook the foundation of a huge number of Shias and drifted away from the Madhab Ahlul Bayt. Because they couldn't accept it. Imam is no longer here, it's not visible. If Imama plays a major role in the whole Shia philosophical thought, he's no longer here. What should we do? You really need to be strong to remain determined, and particularly Sheikh Mufid worked hard. No wonder our living Imam says, my dear brother, in one letter to him. Don't think that we have, the text of the letter makes your hair stand up. Don't think that we have neglected you. We are keeping an eye on you, and we would help you in resolving all of your issues. Ask us the questions, and we would respond. This is unique. So he must have been in a unique position vis-a-vis Ahlul Bayt, and particularly the living. And inshallah, depending on how you decide if you want next week, if you don't want the week after, however you decide. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.